Uh, Colleagues, there is no break between the two sessions, so please remain in your seats. Please, colleagues, take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Distinguished colleagues, welcome to session 3 of the Astana Think Tank Forum. Our session stands between you and our lunch, so please take your seats and bear with us. Our session is devoted to one of the most challenging issues of our times, nuclear challenges, the current state of the non-proliferation regime, and as you know, the global nuclear order that once seemed stable is now under unprecedented stress. Arms control agreements that served as cornerstone of strategic stability are eroding. Trust among major powers is at its lowest level in decades. Modernization programs are accelerating while emerging technologies, hypersonics, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence are blurring the line between conventional and nuclear deterrence. Also, the war in Ukraine has brought nuclear rhetoric back to mainstream politics. We also have other flashpoints such as the Middle East, South Asia, Korean Peninsula, and all these regional crises can escalate in unpredictable ways. So I don't want to take much of your time, and without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Dr. Vladimir Orlov, he's the founding director of the Peer Center and professor at MGIMO University in Moscow. Dr. Orlov is a leading authority on Russian arms control policy and non-proliferation education. Mr. Darrell Kimball is an executive director of the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., one of the most respected voices advocating for renewed US leadership in arms control and disarmament. Ambassador Ali Sarwar Naqvi, he's the Executive Director of the Center for International Strategic Studies in Islamabad, a seasoned diplomat and expert on South Asian security and nuclear governance. Dr. Rajiv Nayan, he's a Senior Research Associate at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. He specializes in export controls, disarmament, and India's strategic posture. And last but not least, Dr. Tariq Rauf, independent expert on nuclear governance, formerly head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. He has a deep experience in the non-proliferation treaty process and international verification. So how will we proceed? Each panelist will have from 5 to 7 minutes to share his remarks. After that, I will follow up with one question to each panelist, and then I will open the floor to your comments and questions. Vladimir Andreevich, вам слово.
Vladimir Andreevich, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As always, I'm very glad to return to Astana. I'd like to express my gratitude for our hosts for organizing this forum and for the invitation. The nuclear weapon, the nuclear challenge, non-proliferation and disarmament is first and foremost the issue. It takes us back to the foundations. The foundation is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which marked its 30th anniversary this very year and was prolonged. Eras have shifted, eras have changed, centuries have changed, but the treaty signed in 1968 is still in place and it's still bringing fruits, ensuring the funds for stability of international security. And today we are not even questioning whether this treaty is still in demand, but we are asking what is its current status and how can we strengthen this treaty. Treaty has 3 key pillars in English, and those pillars equally are of equal importance, equally essential. And if we look at the conditions of each single pillar, we will observe that on the one hand, they are being tested by time. On the other hand, there are undoubtedly certain serious, palpable risks that may turn them into erosion. Being on Kazakh land, we should probably start with the pillar of the disarmament pillar, Article 6 of the treaty. On the one hand, this article functions, and because we do not observe now any nuclear armament competition and rivalry, given very challenging international situation, that is already good news. The Russian-American treaty is being implemented on decreasing the strategic warheads, and the Russian Federation provided an initiative towards Washington on preserving the thresholds for 1 more year, according to this treaty. But upon the termination of this treaty, it cannot be prolonged. We have heard certain signals from Washington, but I would say that as of today, our hand have not yet met the American handshake on the other side. Unfortunately, there are certain trends towards the increase of nuclear warheads in a range of nuclear states. In our PIR center, we are trying to preserve at least the dialects on these issues. We quite frequently meet with both the military and diplomats of the USA, France, and other nuclear states, just to check if we are on the same page. The second pillar focuses on the peaceful development of the nuclear. Again, being on Kazakh land, we need to highlight positive trends of this process. More and more states, world states, most and foremost in Eurasian region and other regions, including Africa, Latin America, are turning both on the nuclear energy, this is not something new to Kazakhstan, and on the developing the nuclear energy, including the agreement on constructing and the NPT in Kazakhstan, which is very much welcomed by us. On the other hand, only during this year we've witnessed how against one member state of the NPT there was what I would call an act of aggression. That was the attack of nuclear facilities in the Islamic Republic of Iran that was held by the Israel and the US. And we observed there are certain terrorist attacks on Russian nuclear energy, nuclear infrastructure at Zaporozhskaya nuclear power plant and Kurskaya NPP. Third pillar, that is the non-proliferation of the nuclear. On the one hand, our picture is not too bad. We see that only one country, that is Korean People's Democratic Republic of Korea, has left the treaty, but Russia thinks that Korea has not fully, Democratic Republic of Korea have not fully left the NPT. But unfortunately, we also observe the trend that more and more states during these challenging times are expressing interest not only towards peaceful nuclear energy, but we see that we provide researchers using the technology, ASIN technology, which proves unsatisfying outcomes that no less than 10, we used to say 9 nuclear states, now it's more than 12 states can be. I don't know, I'm not sure how the translators will translate this, but that's probably devil's 12 are so-called threshold or near threshold condition in terms of they have the opportunity to launch their own military nuclear program and create nuclear weapons. And we see both in Russia and Kazakhstan that some countries are located near our borders. And I believe we need to explore and monitor this trend and discuss this at the expert level, and it should not be skipped by the supervisory process of the NPT members. And my last comment is related to this very issue. The next year, the regular supervisory conference on considering the NPT in New York will take place, and my country and Kazakhstan and majority, but maybe not all, the states that are presented here as participants of the forum, most of these states are the party to this treaty, and they will arrive to New York. And there's a huge question, what will we bring to that conference in New York? During the last supervisor conference in New York, there was the spirit of disagreement, and we in 2022 we've told to our Western partners, please decide what is more important to you, to support the nuclear non-proliferation or the support to Kiev regime. Unfortunately, we have not been heard, or we were heard, but they still took the actions which they took. And we will try to reiterate this, and hopefully today they will hear us better and make certain assumptions. In this regard, in this October 28, my institute, the PIR Center, together with our partner from Switzerland, are holding a meeting to provide so-called check-up of the NPT regime and to see the mood of the NPT and to see whether it is possible and to what extent it is possible to cooperate so that in 2026, during the conference, NPT conference, without any huge ambitions, but we will be able to preserve the previous achievements of the previous generations in terms of stability of the nuclear non-proliferation. We do not count on too ambitious plans or actions, but we just want to confirm that we are all in the same page, that we all support the NPT, and we believe any violations of the NPT is not acceptable. Mr. Ben and many colleagues, Mr. Aben and my colleagues, including colleagues at this panel session, know one of the founders of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, one of the authors of this treaty, that is Roland Mahmutovich Timberbayev, His Excellency Ambassador. He used to frequently visit Kazakhstan, and he appreciated very much meetings of his colleagues, Kazakhstani colleagues. He had a long life, and before leaving this world, in his diary, he put down the following. I would like to quote, and that will be my conclusion. One stray thought he put down in 2008: the further existence of the reduction of nuclear warheads is obviously possible only as a result of certain serious incidents involving nuclear weapon, or maybe even the unavoidable possibility of such a crisis. Let's remember the Caribbean crisis of 1968. Only after that Caribbean crisis, the leading powers and their military seriously recognized what the nuclear weapon is indeed and the possible consequences of its application. That is the rare case when I would like that my teacher would be wrong, would prove wrong, because we really do not need any Caribbean crisis, and we do not need any hints on any further nuclear conflicts. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vladimir Andreevich, for your analysis and for those three essential pillars and the preliminary diagnosis of the non-proliferation regime. Allow me to kindly ask questions. Would you kindly briefly answer them? In the circumstances that we're facing today, what are the realistic measures to restore the trust, to reduce risks in terms of Russian and Western relations, so that the scenario that was delineated by our respectable teacher would not come true? Thank you very much. We need to meet more frequently. We need to talk. We have not provided systematic negotiations for quite a while now, for too long now, and we're losing our experience in negotiations, and the negotiating skills are wasted. And but frankly speaking, we cannot rely on new negotiations, so we need at least to meet to check if we're on the same page or not. And first and foremost, Russia and the US needs to hold this kind of talks. I think we have certain prerequisites, but it is important that other three nuclear states, and two of them are the member of the NATO, and NATO members, and given the war taking place, we need to take into account the accumulated volume of the nuclear warheads of France, Germany, and the US. So these three states also need to be the effective part, efficient part of this dialogue. So far, what we call the nuclear fight is rather dead than alive, but this is a very symbolic life preserving system, and this needs to be changed. Thank you.
The next floor is Dr. Kimball, please.
Well, thank you very much to our host for this invitation to this important gathering. And given Kazakhstan's important role, and it's the role of its people in the quest for a world free of nuclear weapons, it's an honor to be here. The international rules-based order, such as it has been for the last 80 years since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have helped avoid another nuclear conflict, have helped reduce nuclear arsenals, ended nuclear testing, and prevented the wider spread of nuclear weapons. But 80 years into the nuclear age, the risks of nuclear weapons are growing once again. As we sit here today in this lovely meeting hall, human civilization remains precariously tethered to the existence of nuclear weapons and the threat they might be used again in various regions around the world. Dangerous nuclear deterrence relationships exist between and among the world's 9 nuclear-armed states, and at some point it is likely that the dangerous nuclear balance of terror will fail. Worse yet, as my colleague Vladimir said, progress on nuclear disarmament diplomacy is stalled, and there is the risk of an unconstrained three-way nuclear arms race on the horizon. The United States and Russia bear a special responsibility to address this issue. They are the 2 world's largest nuclear-armed states, but China and other nuclear-armed states have a role to play too, as do middle powers like Kazakhstan. In 2024, the UN Secretary General at an address at my organization's annual meeting said that the states with the largest arsenals must find a way back to the negotiating table. He said the US and Russia must re-engage to reduce nuclear stockpiles, prevent nuclear use, stop nuclear saber rattling, and reaffirm support for the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. We also need a renewal of non-proliferation diplomacy and a return of the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to Iran to prevent the possibility of a 10th nuclear-armed state. Breakdown of talks earlier this year between Washington and Tehran over its sensitive nuclear activities and the illegal attacks by nuclear-armed Israel and the United States against safeguarded Iranian nuclear sites has worsened an already difficult situation. So to reinforce the guardrails against nuclear catastrophe and to lead to innovative approaches to reduce the nuclear risk, we have to all collectively ensure that disarmament diplomacy survives and that responsible nuclear and non-nuclear states do even more to provide creative new pathways to move the world back from the nuclear brink. Let me just outline quickly 4 key areas of focus and innovation, and I'm going to talk about one in particular in the short time I have. Number 1, to head off an unconstrained nuclear buildup involving the United States, Russia, and China, all of the world's non-nuclear weapon states should work together to press the US and Russia to respect the current bilateral treaty limits of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty and to start formal talks on new arms control measures and to press China and the United States to engage in nuclear risk reduction talks. Number 2, to reduce the threat of nuclear war, all states need to push back against nuclear threat rhetoric in any region by any government, and to, in particular, press the United States to ratify the protocols to 3 nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, the Central Asia, South Pacific, and African nuclear weapons-free zones, which is necessary to secure the legally binding negative security assurances for the states in these 3 nuclear weapons-free zones. And they are going to have to work together to put this issue on the political agenda in the United States. Number 3, to create new momentum for disarmament, nuclear-armed and non-nuclear states, such as Kazakhstan, should consider convening a series of nuclear disarmament summits to foster multilateral dialogue and to help jumpstart action on practical solutions. My organization put forward a report in 2024 on this concept. It is modeled on the very successful nuclear security summits process that Kazakhstan and other states were a part of over a decade ago. And as I said, number four, in order to avoid a new crisis over Iran's nuclear program, it's important to encourage Iran to allow the return of IAEA inspectors and to encourage Washington and Tehran to resume talks on an interim agreement to avert a deeper nuclear nonproliferation crisis. And states such as China and Kazakhstan and Gulf states in the Persian Gulf region can play an important role. But since we just have a brief amount of time, let me just focus in on the importance of U.S.-Russia cooperation in the near term. For decades, Washington and Moscow have negotiated nuclear arms control and reduction agreements to constrain their massive nuclear forces. But in about 100 days, the last remaining treaty, New START, will expire without a chance for its further extension. Without some form of mutual restraint, it is theoretically possible that the United States and Russia could increase the size of their deployed long-range nuclear arsenals to as much as 3,000 from the current 1,550 limit by uploading additional warheads on their land and sea-based missiles. This would be the first increase in those arsenals in more than 35 years. Now, we have some progress within reach in this area. As Vladimir said, President Putin proposed the two sides should seek a simple, informal deal to maintain the existing caps even after New START expires. And President Trump said on October 5, it's a good idea. So it's important in the coming weeks that the Kremlin and the White House formalize this proposal and immediately direct their teams to begin negotiations on a more comprehensive agreement or agreements to further reduce all types of nuclear weapons in their arsenals. And it's important that other responsible UN member states publicly welcome this initiative and encourage the two countries to re-engage in nuclear disarmament diplomacy. If they do, then there is a chance that the United States and Russia and other countries can call upon China, France, and the United Kingdom, the other three nuclear-armed members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to report on their total nuclear weapons holdings and freeze their nuclear forces at the current number of strategic nuclear launchers. And I would note that at the present time, the U.S. and Russia have approximately 700 long-range nuclear launchers, missiles, and bombers. And China has, according to independent estimates, about 650 strategic nuclear launchers. And the UK and France combined almost 100. So that is more than enough firepower to ensure nuclear deterrence against attack by any other country, and it is far more than is necessary or is safe for global security. So let me stop there, and I can get into some of the other issues and challenges I mentioned in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball, for outlining measures or steps that are necessary for revitalizing the non-proliferation agenda and to make non-proliferation great again. So just as a follow-up, after what Dr. Orlov called the gross violation of international law and you called illegal attacks against Iran, what do you think will happen to Iran's nuclear file? What will happen to Iran's nuclear program? After Iran stopped its cooperation with the IAEA, we don't know what's happening there, what happened to Iran's nuclear materials and so on. So what's your take on that?
Well, even though the United States and Israel attacked the major Iranian nuclear facilities, Iran still has a residual stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, and 400 kilograms of it. It also has centrifuge manufacturing facilities, and it would not take a reconstruction of the Natanz or the Fordow facilities in order to enrich that material to bomb grade. So there is still a proliferation threat, even though Iran claims that it has only peaceful intentions with its nuclear program. So there is a need for diplomacy. It would be extremely damaging for Iran's security if, as threatened, it ends cooperation with the IAEA. That would raise questions about the Supreme Leader's fatwa against nuclear weapons, this edict against nuclear weapons. The problem is that the United States and Iran are not in a mood to renew negotiations right now. And that is also a grave mistake. So it will take, I believe, initiatives by other countries to bring the two parties back together to avoid another crisis or another kinetic attack by the United States or Israel on Iran's facilities. And that could be much more disruptive than the attacks in June were. So this is something that is an urgent problem that could get worse in the next few weeks.
Thank you. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would first like to thank the Kazakhstan Institute of Strategic Studies for inviting me to this important event and a very important conference. The subject that I have, and I see many good friends here, and it's indeed a pleasure apart from the work, the catching up with old associates. The topic that I have, nuclear challenge, non-proliferation and disarmament in an era of strategic rivalry. Now, I, as somebody who's been in this entire field for a very long time, I recall what happened in the NPT when it was drafted. I was then a junior officer in the Foreign Office, and our diplomats, people like Ambassador Agha Shahi, people like Ambassador Iqbal Akhund, people like Ambassador Jamshed Markar, they were actually working on the draft of the NPT in the United Nations. Why didn't we sign the NPT? Why did my colleague from India not sign the NPT? Is because of the fact that it is discriminatory. It is a treaty which gives the ultimate elite level to 5 nuclear powers and cuts off the rest. And that is at the core of the weakness of the NPT, which is now catching up with it. So I can talk about this indefinitely. We did not sign it because Article 6 was not drafted the way it should have been, as it was proposed. Article 6 did not make it mandatory upon the nuclear powers to give up their nuclear weapons. But I'll talk now about basically our region, because focus has not been put on South Asia. You see, before 1974, there were no nuclear weapons in South Asia. South Asia was a nuclear-free area. And in 1974, India, my friend's country, decided to do its nuclear test. And that instigated us to have our nuclear weapons program. And Therefore, we became a nuclear affected region. But Pakistan from 1974 to 1997 was tabling a resolution every year in the United Nations for a nuclear weapon-free zone in South Asia. When I went to the UN in New York in the 80s, we used to be soliciting support for that resolution, and we always used to get more than 100 votes on this nuclear weapon-free zone for South Asia. This is history. We should remember what happened, why things went wrong. Now, nuclear rivalry in South Asia began with the nuclear test conducted by India in 1974. Pakistan initially sought restraint, but proposing the nuclear weapon-free zone in South Asia. But the situation was very complicated. We had had 3 wars between us in 1948, and 1965, and 1971. And when the tests came in 1974, we both went nuclear, one after the other. Over the past 2 decades, and I'm coming now to the present, South Asia has remained under a persistent nuclear shadow. In this regard, there have been escalatory behavior, which, like the 2001 Parliament attack and build-up of Indian forces on the borders, then the Mumbai and the Uri attack, and the Pulwama and Balakot crisis, and now the May 2025 clash. This has repeatedly tested deterrence stability in South Asia, though we have had deterrence stability all these years, and brought the region frequently to the brink of nuclear exchange. Here, 2 things have happened. I mean, I represent Pakistan, so I am talking of 2 things. One is India's rapid military modernization, and the second, support by the United States in a kind of exceptionalism for India, which has affected deterrence stability, has affected non-proliferation, has affected the possibility of disarmament in our region. So, the pattern of missile tests and successive airspace NOTAMs since May 2025 is clearly oriented to the Western Front, towards Pakistan, and is therefore directed towards us. Specifically, India conducted 2 consecutive flight tests of Pralay, a conventional short-range ballistic missile, in July this year, a long-range Agni-5 ballistic missile test in August 2025, and an Agni Prime medium-range ballistic missile, a canisterized dual-capable system from a rail-based mobile launcher in September 2025. So, that has led to concern in Pakistan, which still is there, very much there. India's no first use pledge no longer appears credible. Counterforce rhetoric, preemptive thinking, and the integration of conventional and nuclear planning suggest a shift from restraint to risk acceptance. In response, Pakistan adopts full spectrum deterrence within a credible minimum deterrence framework to deter aggression at tactical, operational, and strategic levels without seeking numerical parity or an arms race. We don't want an arms race. Pakistan has always maintained this. This approach is calibrated, restrained, and designed to prevent war, not to fight one. And in this context, let me mention that Kashmir remains the central flashpoint. India's aggressive signaling, misadventure, number of false flag operations in 2019, 2025 continue to compress time for diplomatic intervention. The idea of limited war under the nuclear overhang, embedded in India's strategic thinking, is both destabilizing and illusory. Pakistan's swift and credible responses have shown that there is no space for limited war between two nuclear states. The 2025 standoff was the stark reminder of this reality. Misperceptions, rapid mobilization, and the absence of credible communication channels compressed decision time to minutes, a situation diffused only through Pakistan's proportionate and calibrated response. I am taking a bit of time, and I don't want to keep on citing all these instances, but I have given you the general thrust of what the overall situation in South Asia looks like. The involvement of major powers adds another layer of complexity. The US-India strategic alignment under the Indo-Pacific and Quad frameworks has also challenged South Asia's deterrence equilibrium. There is no regional arms control architecture for today's realities. Existing CBMs are narrow and do not cover cruise missiles, UAVs, hypersonic cyberspace interference, or maritime encounters. The way forward lies in renewing arms control dialogue, updating bilateral confidence building measures, strengthening maritime safety protocols, and ensuring non-interference with nuclear command and control or early warning systems. Above all, South Asia's stable deterrence hinges upon transparency, dialogue, and need for responsible state behavior by all parties concerned. In this era of renewed strategic rivalry, the core principle must remain the same. As Reagan and Gorbachev declared, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. South Asia's strategic stability depends on remembering this truth. I will conclude, Mr. Darren, with a small anecdote, if you may allow me to narrate. Many years ago, I met Dr. Henry Kissinger in New York with my ambassador. I was then not an ambassador yet. And we talked about India-Pakistan relations and the problem in this subcontinent. Dr. Kissinger heard us for about 10, 12, 15 minutes, whatever. And he said that I understand why you talk about India all the time, because you are small and you are weak. But what I don't understand is why the Indians talk about Pakistan all the time, even though they are so big and so powerful. So, we have this problem and we have to work it out and we have to sit together and talk. And that's where things stand. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing Pakistan's stance on the NPT, on strategic stability in South Asia, and for sharing this anecdote with Henry Kissinger. So let's hear from this powerful neighbor of yours. So, Dr. Nayan, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. As you wished, why did Kissinger ask? India always talking Pakistan, so today I will not talk about Pakistan, despite all the statements he made. But as of course he raised some very vital points. It will not be in the context of India and Pakistan. Today we have gathered here to discuss a very constructive framework, and the constructive framework is how to build from polarization to partnerships. So how the world can have partnership on nuclear issues, non-proliferation, disarmament in the era of strategic rivalry. So I will talk that, and I'll mention about the issues, some of the issues which have been raised. So fortunately, despite all the provocations, what we find that nuclear order is still intact. It has not been disturbed much, although it has always been in flux. Once it was unilateral, now it has got unipolar, now it has got multipolar. And that reality sometimes may haunt, but what we find after these three conflicts which are generally mentioned, that order is still being maintained. Like it or not, the global nuclear deterrence structure is still intact. The taboo, nuclear taboo, is still somehow being continued. Rule-based order or not, I don't know, because there is no rule to prevent a country from using nuclear weapons, or there is no rule yet to prevent a country from threatening to use nuclear weapons. So I don't know whether we can see that this rule-based order on nuclear use or threatening to use is still existing, but I agree with the term popularized by Nina Tannenwald that nuclear taboo exists, not between two nuclear armed countries or nuclear weapon countries, but also nuclear weapon countries and non-nuclear weapon countries. Despite not facing reprisals, what we have discovered, that even nuclear weapon countries has abstained from using nuclear weapons against weak countries or the countries who cannot retaliate. So this stark reality we have to keep in mind. And after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as rightly pointed out, there is no use of nuclear weapons. Another very good point which has emerged out of this, all the crisis or rivalry, is that the doctrine, I emphasize, the doctrine to use nuclear weapon first has failed to deliver. Because it knows that the moment you use this, if it is a nuclear weapon country, there will be retaliation. And it could be massive retaliation. So that is being realized. And even against those who cannot retaliate, the world public opinion will be against you, and you will have to pay a higher price to manage this public opinion. So that's why we find that despite all the saber rattling we are talking about, on many things we are talking about, there was no use. Several times we heard that nuclear weapons will be used, tactical, but it was not used. So this, we should be thankful to those who really, those who appeared using these weapons. And if you really dissect, I have written a couple of articles on that, you'll find that, yes, the word nuclear has come back in the security discourse, but in recent years, but somehow if you really go through it, you'll find that it is basically politics of using nuclear weapons, sometimes for bargaining and sometimes for mobilizing public opinion against it. So that is a very consoling point. This is what I am really very happy. The tendency to not disturb strategic stability still exists, and this is what we have to really take into account. Now coming to why it happened. NPT, yes, when India started with it, we all like Pakistan, we found it discriminatory. But now we find that this is the mainstay of global stability, strategic stability. So we are realizing that this is the mainstay of global nuclear order. So should we destroy it, or should we work to just make it collapse? So generally there is a tendency to even if you are not joining it, then you don't somehow disturb this regime. So what we are finding now, even if there is no universal membership, you will find that universal adherence to this treaty exists. And that we have to take into account. Even those who are protesting against the treaty, those who are members, inside NPT different conferences, they are also not coming out of the treaty. They protest and then they keep quiet. And this is how the treaty or the nuclear order is being maintained. And so I think this is it bad or good? So I'll say it is good. So then we can take a new step forward instead of just having a new system being erected. So now we are talking about the how we should innovatively approach the issue. Of course, nuclear disarmament is the solution. We have to move step by step. But before that, to build confidence among those who have got nuclear weapons and those who have not got nuclear weapons, we must build trust. This is what we are here to discuss about. And that is negative security assurance, as has been rightly pointed out, that we will not threaten anyone. That is one good thing. And from other side also, treaty compliance should be there. There is no doubt about that. If you have given a commitment that you will not build bombs, you should not build bombs. So this is what we should adhere to. And plus, reducing nuclear security, the institutions which have been built for bringing about disarmament, nuclear weapons free world, I think that should be strengthened. That should be again made functional, which have become by and large non-functional. This is what doctrinal level changes must be made. And we have to pay attention to that. Some of the issues which have been raised, I think, in very briefly, I don't have any intention to come and to answer, because I'm not an official, answer Pakistan's point of view, but as a scholar, I would like to just touch upon. First of all, there are 4 or 5 major problems with this kind of formulation. First, how do you define region? Is region South Asia, or the region also includes China? So that is one major problem which has been really being debated on for long. India's region, security region, also includes China. So I don't think, that's why I believe there is no regional solution coming, because generally it is believed that nuclear weapons has got global reach. Pakistan will say India, India will say China, China will say United States. So this ring will continue. So I think we should work for global nuclear disarmament instead of just having any regional solution, because it will fail. It is good for rhetoric, but not for actual things. So I think that part we have to think about. About 1974 test, was it a nuclear weapon test? I think there are a number of writings have come. Until and unless if you don't revisit or visit those articles, this will come. 98, India nuclearized itself, and followed by Pakistan. I think that fact we should keep in mind. And why the problem is coming in the region, broader region. Sometimes because of, as Ambassador Sajjan Har pointed out, if there is regional violation or border violation taking place, sometimes by intrusion or sometimes by encroachment or sometimes by sending terrorists. If terrorism, if innocent people are killed, definitely a nation, a sovereign nation, has a right to retaliate and take corrective measure. So that should not be forgotten, that any terror attack will be again responded to. So we should work so that there is no resumption of conflict. And then this nuclear conflict, of course, should never take place. I completely agree with him. Nuclear war cannot be fought, so it should not be, and nuclear war cannot be won, so it should not be fought. So I think that point we must remember. And no first use, let us start with that. If it is credible or not credible, that I think the world should move towards that. Then you can hold a country responsible whether you are really adhering to it or not. And there should be a treaty. Only then you can have issue of compliance. If there is no treaty, there will not be compliance. I think that part we can constructively approach. This is what I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nayan. I will refrain from follow-up questions since we are almost out of time. So I would like to give the floor to our final panelist, Tariq Rauf. Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be back in Kazakhstan. I've had a long history of being associated with Kazakhstan's important efforts in promoting nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. So if we look at Kazakhstan, it shares borders with 2 nuclear weapon states. It has 2 nuclear armed states on its southern border, not that far, and there are 4 other nuclear armed states in the near abroad of Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan, in a sense, is encircled by 8 out of the 9 nuclear armed states that exist in the world today. So it's not surprising that Kazakhstan has been a leader in promoting disarmament. Were it not for Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union would not have called a moratorium on nuclear testing in 1990. Were it not for Kazakhstan, the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, where 415 detonations took place, would not have been closed. And without these 2 important events, we would not have had a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty in 1996. I'm pleased to note that Kazakhstan has now decided to build 2 nuclear power plants. One will be a VVER, 1,200 megawatt Generation 3 reactor from Rosatom in Russia, and a Hualong advanced power reactor, 1,000 megawatts from the China National Nuclear Corporation. Now, 40% of the world's nuclear production and exports come from Kazakhstan. The Ulba metallurgical plant in formerly Osk-Aminogorsk, now Oskimen, is a world leader in producing nuclear fuel. It is also the place where the IAEA's low-enriched uranium bank is located, that I had the privilege of leading that project at the IAEA. So I would now like to suggest that, given the fact that at the last COP meeting on climate change, countries adopted the goals of tripling nuclear energy or nuclear electricity production by 2050. So that means there are a number of new countries engaging in nuclear power activities, Bangladesh, Turkey, Kazakhstan, among others. So today there are 473 reactors producing 10% of the world's electricity. By 2050, it's projected to go around 25 to 30%. So where will the nuclear fuel come for these new reactors? So I would like to propose that Kazatomprom, which is in a sense the owner of the Ulba metallurgical plant, seriously consider also developing a uranium enrichment capability at the Ulba metallurgical plant. Today, 44% of the world's enrichment is done by Rosatom, somewhere around 17% by Uranocycle of France, about 15% by Urenco, which is a European consortium, and the remaining 24% or so is done by the China National Nuclear Corporation. There's no reason in the world why these 4 enrichers should continue to control the world's civilian enrichment capability. The IAEA knows, the International Atomic Energy knows, and has been verifying centrifuge plants and reprocessing plants for decades. There is nothing in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that prevents a non-nuclear weapon state from getting into uranium enrichment, provided it's under IAEA safeguards and is used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Now, some may find this to be rather controversial, but it's important to discuss some new ideas. Now, I'm glad that my friend Volodya Orlov raised the issue of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the next 11th NPT review conference coming up at the United Nations in New York in April and May next year. Now, last year, Kazakhstan was the chair of the second preparatory committee meeting for this review conference, and the president of that, or the chair, was Ambassador Akan Rahmatulin, who until this past Monday was Deputy Foreign Minister, and now was succeeded by Deputy Foreign Minister Ashok Bayev. So next year, Kazakhstan will be chairing an important committee at the review conference that deals with nuclear verification and nuclear security. Very likely it would be Ambassador Kairat Omarov, who former foreign minister and now permanent representative of Kazakhstan in New York. And this, given the fact that it's Kazakhstan, I'm sure that it will have a lot of success in at least getting agreement on that particular pillar of the NPT. And I would also propose that, like I've been doing for some number of years, that the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences should be moved out of New York to Vienna. Because two of the three pillars of the NPT have always been in Vienna. And New York now is becoming increasingly politicized. It's way more expensive than Vienna. Many smaller countries have a big problem in affording hotel prices in Manhattan, over $400 a night and so on. So I hope that in its chairmanship and in the year up to it, Kazakhstan, at least in the non-aligned movement, where there is the main opposition to moving the review conference out of New York to Vienna. Now I want to talk a little bit about having a dialogue between Russia, China, and the United States on strategic stability and basic principles. In May 1972, in Vladivostok, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed on a very important communique. This was called Basic Principles. And it was on the basis of these basic principles on conducting relations between the two countries, especially on strategic nuclear issues, that we had the origins of strategic nuclear arms control. We had the important anti-ballistic missile treaty, the original strategic arms limitation agreements, and in a sense, it created a common strategic language between Moscow and Washington, which allowed the two sides to talk about nuclear arms control, strategic stability, crisis stability, first strike stability in a manner that the two sides could understand each other. Now, over the past decades, unfortunately, this understanding has been eroded, and we need to come back to basic principles. And since, for the time being, China is not ready to engage in nuclear arms control talks with the United States or any other country bilaterally or plurilaterally, having a basic principles communique or an understanding between the United States and China would be an important start. So this is where the two sides could at least begin to talk about concepts in terms of regulating and understanding nuclear arms control and nuclear weapons, where the two sides understand each other. Now, U.S. thinking on nuclear deterrence has been determined by a number of important civilian strategists such as Thomas Schelling, Morton Halperin, and so on, and that has permeated down the decades into new nuclear armed states, Pakistan and India, and the analysts in Pakistan and India feel very proud when they can recite the conclusions and findings of Thomas Schelling. But China is thinking very differently. Today, they're not talking about nuclear deterrence, they're talking about intelligentized warfare, bringing in artificial intelligence, multi-domain warfare, and it's a completely different language. And so what Beijing is talking about nuclear issues and what Washington is talking about nuclear issues is on two different axes. So we need to find a way that the two sides can at least begin to communicate with each other. And then putting sanctions on the Chinese defense minister and then knocking on the door in Beijing, please come and talk to us on arms control, is not a practical option. So again, we need to avoid these types of actions that do not promote building of dialogue and building of bridges. And finally, I think eventually there need to be three-party talks. Again, on some form of basic principles, building on the concept from May 1972. Many of those are still relevant. Not much has changed. Of course, there are other areas where we have new types of weapon systems, anti-satellite weapons, artificial intelligence, new types of delivery systems, hypersonic delivery systems, and so on. Nonetheless, it provides the basis for the beginnings of a dialogue between the three sides. And I like the idea by Darrell Kimball of a nuclear security summit. You might recall that in the 1970s, there was a global conference on the prevention of nuclear war. There's also an agreement on the prevention of nuclear war. So I think one initiative that Kazakhstan could consider between now and April of 2026 is also an international conference on the prevention of nuclear war, which would bring in all of the 9 nuclear armed states, as well as other states that do not possess nuclear weapons, because as the UN Secretary General has said on more than one occasion, the risk and dangers of nuclear war today are greater than they were at the height of the Cold War, and we are just one miscalculation away in the war in Ukraine between Russian airplanes and NATO airplanes, a crash, a shoot down, and we don't know what the outcome of that would be. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Tariq. Of course, 1 hour is definitely not enough to discuss such complicated issues. But before we go to lunch, let me allow one question from the audience. So if you have an urgent question that you'd like to ask our panelists, please, are welcome. Anyone? So if not,
Since there are no questions at the moment, I assume that everyone is completely assured that nuclear weapons do not pose a threat. Is that correct? All right, not a good assumption. On my hotel television channels is Netflix. I assume many of you know about this streaming service. For those of you who want to consider this issue a little bit more deeply, there is a movie that will be appearing on Netflix on October 24th that outlines a scenario that could lead to nuclear war. It is realistic, it is disconcerting, and it touches upon all of the issues that we raised here. It's called A House of Dynamite. So I would just encourage everyone, whether you're working in this issue or working on another issue, take a look at that movie and consider some of the ideas and issues that we've presented to you here today. And thanks for your attention.
I also want to make one last comment. At the G20 Summit's Leaders Summit, at the G7 Leaders Summit, people are now using this term, a nuclear war cannot be won, it must never be fought, and it was also raised here. But this is cherry picking from the understanding reached between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1986 at the Reykjavik and Geneva summits. And this particular understanding is based on a foundation. And that foundation was, one, neither side will seek superiority, military superiority over the other side. Neither side will seek to fight a conventional or a nuclear war. And on the basis of this foundation, they said, of course, a nuclear war cannot be won, and therefore must never be fought. But to cherry pick this one line without having any other foundation doesn't really make sense. It has cheapened this concept, and again, particularly in civil society, we need to bring this back up, that just repeating ad nauseum a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought in and of itself is not sufficient, because it is not based on any understandings that lead to the situation where a nuclear war would not be fought, or there would be a risk of escalation from a conventional conflict into a nuclear conflict.
Thank you. So during our session, we've heard realistic assessments, pessimistic assessments, cautiously optimistic assessments of the state and future of the non-proliferation regime. So let me thank our panelists, and please join me in giving the round of applause to our speakers. So we're now going to have lunch, and please be back at 2:30 p.m.